All right, can anyone hear me now? Okay, good. So, in this live stream, I'll be talking about why public transportation should be like mandatory for every major city, such as Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, etc. So, I'm going to try to share my screen. All right. So, this is what I'm going to show a bunch of images for you. So it increases exercise. There's a lot less air pollution. Oh yeah, there's another picture. Okay, I want to show you guys. So this image is comparing the amount of space comparing cars, bus, and bicycles. So you'll need a lot of space for like cars, bus not many, and bicycles not really. So oh yeah. Mm. Oh yeah, this one right here. So the hidden savings of public transportation. 340 million gallons of fuel saved due to less congestion because of public transportation. 1.4 to 9 less auto miles traveled for every mile traveled by public transportation. 102.2 billion fewer miles traveled because of public transportation, and 3.4 of annual US vehicle miles traveled. And 37 million metric tons of CO2 are not released. This is also like pros of public transportation too. Okay, so I think I'm gonna like pull up a video from YouTube. Oh, there's a video about like, there's a lot. which just ignore the ad, everyone. All right, let's try this one more time. Sorry for keeping you guys bored. All right.
"17 minutes. That's how long Americans had to wait on average to get on public transit in 2022.
Transit in the U.S. is awful, with few exceptions in a few places. It's infrequent, it's not all day, it's unreliable.
Meanwhile, 45% of Americans have no access to public transportation at all.
The real problem in the US is what I would call transit deserts, right? I mean, these are just places where it is just complete and total nightmare to try to get anywhere on transit, whether to work or, to play, to pick up your kids. You just can't depend on it.
The US spent $79 billion on public transit in 2019. Yet most public transit across the nation is finding itself in a fiscal crisis. In 2021, the US was $176 billion behind in updating the poor conditions of public transit. That backlog is expected to grow to $250 billion by the year 2029. Ultimately, it's the riders who are paying for the deficit.
The pandemic money is going to run out. And so there will be, I think there will be fare increases, but even more, I think because of the politics of it, there will be service reduction. And many places have predicted that.
So just how did public transit in the US get so awful? And can it be improved? The US government has long favored cars over public transportation.
When we talk about money for transit, we talk about funding. But when we talk about the same public money for roads, we often hear the word investment.
We're spending far more, hundreds of billions more, on road improvement and infrastructure than we are on transit.
For example, US railways combining commuter, heavy, and light rail grew by 945 miles between 2010 and 2020. During the same period, highways were expanded by over 100,000 miles.
In transportation, we very often have no choices. If we're talking about local or area transportation, it's very often only driving.
History plays a big role in this discrepancy. There was a time when the US boasted a public transit system that was the envy of the world.
Prior to 1920s, we had a very good streetcar system in our cities.
These were trams that were running typically in the middle of the street. You would board them at your convenience. They were often so frequent that you didn't have to plan ahead.
During its peak in the 1920s, Americans living in cities averaged more than 250 streetcar trips per year. But the electric streetcar business was far from profitable. Inflation drove up the operating costs, but businesses were unable to raise fares accordingly, and services quickly began to deteriorate as a result.
When the streetcar companies, which were private, went to the government and so forth and said, please help us, city governments, state governments, and of course the federal government wasn't involved at all in this period, basically turned a blind eye.
By the end of World War I, a third of transit companies were already in bankruptcy. And America had found its newest obsession: cars.
People who wanted to sell more cars, reframed the car as an all-purpose
I mean, don't get me
transport
wrong, cars
necessity
are really
instead
cool.
of a special purpose mobility tool. And when they turned it into that, they really convinced a lot of people that you need this to go everywhere and that you're not living in a modern, progressive city until it's a city that lets you drive everywhere.
And with the influx of money and aid from policies, cities began to quickly transform around cars.
They forced private transit companies whenever possible to strip out the streetcar lines. They created all these one-way streets to speed up automobiles. They built parkways. They built highways.
And when people said, wait a minute, is this really the right way to do it? The answer was, oh, it's just supply and demand. It's a free market. Drivers are voting with their gas pedals, and we need to build the roads and streets for the people who are paying for them.
There is a kind of a time lag between public investment in highway infrastructure versus transit infrastructure in our nation. There was at least 40 to 50 years of lag, and the federal government did not get into public transportation funding programs until late 1960s.
Today, that disparity is more evident through partisan differences. The ratio in which funding is distributed between highways and public transit became the main point of contention over the 2021 infrastructure bill. Democrats wanted just 20% of the budget to go towards mass transit, while Republicans pushed for less. Democrats eventually compromised to pass the bill through the Senate.
We have identified the automobile with personal individual liberty. We also associate driving particularly with suburban and rural America, while public transit we associate with urban America. Those correlations then bleed into political correlations of similar kinds, where fostering more driving tends to be something that's favored in more conservative, more Republican, more rural areas.
A study from 2021 revealed that 77% of liberal respondents believe that transport policy should shift more trips towards public transit, walking, and bicycling, while 53% of conservatives believe that transport policy should make it easier for most people to drive. The discrepancy was even higher with very liberal or conservative respondents.
It's very hard politically to get that kind of momentum. Cities are a little bit easier, but states, very hard to get that suburban voter who is very powerful in almost every state legislature. Very hard to get federal officials behind this because, again, the payoff politically, because it's a relatively small number of users, very small. It can be 1%, 2%, 3% in most cities. That's not the loud voices. The loud voices are going to be the drivers.
Funding is one of the main reasons behind the poor state of public transit in the US.
Right now, the federal money that goes to transit services is largely limited to the capital costs. That means, building the infrastructure or buying the vehicles. But the operating costs are where the transit services are really pinched.
Public transit relies heavily on subsidies because it's still far from a profitable business. Take the MTA, the nation's largest public transit, for example. In 2022, less than a quarter of the MTA's revenue came from rider fares. By comparison, revenue from dedicated taxes and subsidies from local governments made up 40% of its total revenue.
The cost of living, the cost of operations, the cost of construction, all of that over the last, 40, 50 years has far exceeded what is collected in fares.
Current subsidies simply aren't enough to cover the costs. The MTA's finances were hit hard by the pandemic, resulting in temporary aid from the federal government. Yet it still reported a budget deficit of $1.9 billion in 2022. This problem extends beyond New York City. Philadelphia's SEPTA predicts it will see a deficit of almost $269 million by 2027. Chicago's RTA predicts a budget gap of $730 million by 2026, while LA Metro's budget gap expects to reach $1 billion by the end of 2026. These financial deficits lead to...
So what do you guys think about the deficits of most major cities?
directly to deteriorating services.
Notion has been the centerpiece of my workflow. It's quite
Seriously,
literally an
what's with
extension
the
of my
ads?
brain. I can take notes, create folders, manage tasks.
If a transit system doesn't have enough money, we can limit the hours of service, we can limit the frequency of service, we can limit the extent of the network. But all of those things also deter ridership and encourage people to depend on their car.
In a 2022
Yeah,
survey
it's
on
pretty
incentives
crazy.
around public transit, Americans chose accurate and reliable arrival times as the second biggest reason that would encourage them to use public transit more often, right behind lower fares.
Public transportation is so expensive to run in the United States is because of the lack of usage. Mass transit need mass to be successful.
Ridership has continuously declined since 2015, and after seeing a steep drop during the pandemic, ridership has failed to recover to its previous levels.
It's a vicious cycle, right? If we have less users, less riders, it's difficult to justify significant public investment in that system. And therefore, it's become more difficult to provide quality service. And because you have a lack of quality of service, you will continue to have lack of users and riders.
There
If
should
the
be more
riders
people
are
using
either
the subway.
insufficient in number or do not provide a fare, right, that covers those costs, you have to make up that money in public subsidies. And in the United States, the structure of funding for public transit is insufficient to basically
transit should
really
be
make
cheap
up
because not
for
everyone
that
drives.
missing
I totally
enormous
agree with
chunk of
that.
money to fund operations and capital.
But a thriving public transit system is beneficial for all Americans. The American Public Transportation Association estimates that 87% of trips on transit directly benefit the local economy, with nearly $42 billion in transit spending going directly to the private sector. A dollar invested in public transit is believed to generate $5 in economic returns.
I mean, look what happened with Amazon. Where did Amazon locate its new, second headquarters, right? Right where one of the better, mass transit systems operate. Transit is really great for an employer because it gives them more options, right, in terms of labor.
We can connect.
I agree completely. It also helps create new jobs as well.
People to employment opportunities, including people who can't necessarily afford an automobile, which is a very expensive thing both to buy and to operate and maintain.
When you don't have transportation,
you also have to pay taxes whenever you drive a car or when you own one. Not saying that cars are bad, but they are pretty expensive.
everything else become a domino effect. You may end up with not able to connect with your family and friends, not able to go to doctor appointments, and not able to have a good income to sustain your house.
And in the end, it can even benefit the drivers themselves.
The more we attract people into rail or buses or other forms of public transit, the fewer people are driving on the roads, and that makes driving.
Doesn't this look like a nightmare? Because to me, it sure does, with all that traffic.
The fewer people are driving on the roads, and that makes driving better for people who want to drive.
Ultimately, the future of public transit relies on whether it can receive the proper investment needed to improve services.
To break the vicious cycle, we need a significant investment from the federal government. I mean, I don't think just with local innovations we can solve this problem of this magnitude.
We'd have to spend a lot of money up front in order to get systems that cost a lot less to operate, because you'd have more robust ridership.
Cities can also be reimagined and redesigned to better serve public transit.
The kind of density levels that most American suburbs have, very difficult to serve effectively by transit, even buses. You have to create more dense neighborhoods, and particularly, this is really important, you have to change the zoning and the density around transit.
I conceptualize public transportation as a public space. If you think about in a city, how much space we have really help people with different background come together. There is a
I mean, that's a good way to that's another good reason for public transportation. It brings different kinds of people together. And it provides more space too. Unlike 5 to 10 lane freeways.
Diminishing number of places that we have in our city. If we have a good public transportation system, it's like the core spaces for people with different background, different class, different gender, race, ethnicity to interact and to encounter. And I think that's very important for the future of our society.
So, what do you think about that video? And comment your thoughts on the live chat below. Okay, so I'm gonna share another video for you guys. Okay, so this is another video that we're gonna watch. Please just ignore the ad.
You wish for. Your site traffic is skyrocketing until this happens.
Have you ever walked through a great city and thought, wow, I love this place?
Same.
Places that are unique and interesting. Places where you feel like grabbing a drink and sitting down to enjoy yourself. Places you purposefully go to on vacation. Places that are memorable. And of course, there are urban places that are miserable. Places you go to only if you have to. Places you leave as soon as you can. Places that are forgettable. What is it that makes some places great and others, well, not? One key factor is what urban planners call a sense of place. When you get it right, you know it. And when you get it wrong, you end up feeling like you're in no place at all. When you're somewhere with a strong sense of place, it feels unique. The Great Market Square in Bruges doesn't look like Santorini's Ia Street, which doesn't look like Rocio Square in Lisbon. That makes it hard to generalize about great places, but still, there are a few characteristics that most of these places share that can give us an idea of how to build better urban places. The first is a sense of enclosure. Some planners think of spaces like city squares and streets as public rooms, and to make a room, you need walls. There are no hard and fast rules for enclosure for streets, but one rule of thumb that's often mentioned in urban planning documents is to have no more than a 3-to-1 ratio of street width to building height, or the other way around, and no more than 6-to-1 for public squares. And for what it's worth, many of the best examples of great streets do have this kind of ratio, and many of the best examples of terrible streets don't. That being said, there are examples where this doesn't fit at all. St. Peter's Square in the Vatican definitely has a great sense of place, but it's also very wide with about a 12-to-1 ratio of width to height, though it does have an obelisk to break it up in the middle. Of course, these extreme cases only work when they don't have cars in them. This would entirely lose its sense of place with Toronto's Highway 401 running through it, which would actually fit, though you'd have to bulldoze the basilica. Regardless, feeling like you're in a specific public room helps define an area's sense of place and makes it distinct from other places nearby. If you're on a particularly wide street or large square, there are other ways to create a sense of enclosure. Planners might use trees on the sides or in the median of a road, or awnings and banners. There are lots of examples of these kind of places that I travel through on a regular basis. Here on Apollolaan in Amsterdam, this street has an extremely wide right-of-way, but there's only one lane for cars, and the line of trees breaks up the space into multiple places, making it feel more inviting. Trees that grow out enough to touch each other are called a kissing canopy, and this can be used to give a place a roof. These are some of the most cozy streets you'll find anywhere. There are actually lots of creative ways to create enclosure. At the market and Dolat Square in Zagreb, they use matching umbrellas as a sort of makeshift roof. And Rotterdam really took the whole enclosure thing literally when they built this enormous covered market. In car-dependent suburbia, the wide open spaces don't contribute to a sense of enclosure, and you don't have a sense of where the place you're in begins or ends. Ultimately, it's hard to give an area a sense of enclosure when there needs to be ample free parking. This makes everywhere feel like one sea of mediocrity. As you travel through these areas, every place feels like every other place. What makes this crappy strip mall any different from this one thousands of kilometers away? They feel like the same place, which is to say, no place. At least this.
Most strip malls in America look the same. And they don't really look anything special. I mean, most of them don't look awful or anything, but they just look nothing special.
This one in LA has palm trees, but it still sucks. This lack of place is why standing in a parking lot like this feels so depressing. Places with lots of surface parking lots totally lose their sense of enclosure and end up feeling lifeless and empty. Of course, the cars and asphalt everywhere don't help either. Compare this suburban shopping area in my hometown to this recently renovated downtown street in the same city. And to be clear, this doesn't have to be a downtown versus suburbs thing. This street and this street are the same distance from their respective city centers, but one is designed primarily for people while the other is designed primarily for cars. So one is an interesting and memorable place, while the other is a car sewer surrounded by a sea of asphalt. With a strong sense of place, you'll also have eye-level interest, or what normies call stuff to look at. If the street is a public room, this is what goes on the walls. There are shop windows, stalls, outdoor cafes, and public art. This is where little details can make a really big difference. When you're on foot, you really notice things like the mosaic facade on the Café Biard in Paris, or the intricate concrete details on the Diamant House in Prague. You're not going to notice this stuff when driving. Compare that kind of visual interest to a typical suburban facade. This looks like the walls of a prison. If you're unlucky enough to have to walk next to this, you'll get to look at cigarette butts and cheap aluminum siding. Most people don't want to live in a room that looks like this. So why would we want to be constantly surrounded by places that look like this? Another element of great places is entrance frequency, the number of other places you can access from a street. You want to be able to stop off at a variety of businesses at regular walkable intervals. The best example of this done wrong is suburban power centers like this one. The entrances to these places are so far apart that most people get back in their cars and drive to them. Entrance frequency is also really important for public squares and plazas. If you want to go to a place, you have to be able to get to the place. Dolat Square, the one with the umbrellas, is a fully enclosed area, but there are multiple entrances. Those entrances connect to nearby streets and public transit options. But if this were built in suburbia, you'd need to completely surround this plaza with parking like at a shopping mall. All of a sudden, it's harder to get there unless you drive your car, and your sense of place is erased. What seems like a more attractive place to hang out, this or this? See, when a city considers a sense of place, it has to make choices about what the place means. What are the city's values? What are its unique attributes? How does it serve the community? Defining a sense of place means defining your own identity. Are you a city that values dining and cafe culture? Or maybe you used to be an industrial city, but you're reshaping your identity with art. Are you a city that takes pains to preserve its history? Or is your city rapidly modernizing? How you design a place is how you design your identity. This place says nothing about identity except that they value cars more than they value people. One of the few examples of a strong sense of place in most US and Canadian cities are ethnic enclaves like Chinatowns, Little Havana in Miami, or Old Quebec City, which immigrants use to recreate the unique places of their home countries. And those places have been kept this way for tourism purposes because people want a sense of place. Since they're in North America, however, these places still cede way too much space to car traffic, but they're generally better than other nearby areas. To recreate the sense of place from the towns they're based on, they have frequent entrances to specialty shops and restaurants, street-level details that are specific to that area, and a sense of enclosure that separates them from the world outside. The walls of the public room are decorated and interesting to look at, and you can't mistake them for any other place in the same city. This is what it looks like when you're specifically designing with a sense of place in mind. Though even great places can start to lose their distinctiveness when they become the same as everywhere else. For example, it's hard to guess where you are if a place becomes filled with the same chain stores as every other place. Paris is famous for its unique streets and architecture and what planning experts call Frenchiness. I'm sure that's the technical term. But the Champs-Élysées is starting to become more generic as major brands move in, which risks turning this unique place into just another mall. This is why Amsterdam has been recently controlling the types of shops that can open in the city center. Sorry, Five Guys will need to open somewhere else. So, of course, the 17th century canal ring of Amsterdam has a strong sense of place. There's nowhere quite like it, which is why it's flooded with tourists from all over the world and most locals avoid it. But it sure was nice during the coronavirus lockdowns. But really, almost every place I visit in Amsterdam has some sense of place. All of these places feel unique and different, and I've noticed a very remarkable difference in how I navigate here. In North America, I think about streets and roads. My mental map is based on major streets and cardinal directions. But in Amsterdam, I think about places. I'm in one place, and I think about all the places I need to pass through in order to get to another place. My mental map is full of the best routes from one place to another, and I think about the city as a series of unique places. This strong sense of place makes the city mean something to me. I actually care about these places, and I like being in them. There's a common response I get when showing video from car-dependent places. People say, this looks just like where I live, but I know it's not. Because when you design a place for cars, everything starts to look the same. This could be anywhere. And after living somewhere like this, I'll never be able to go back to car dependency. Because a place that could be any place is no place at all. I'd like to thank my supporters on Nebula and Patreon who pay me to travel.
Alrighty, everyone. So how was that video? I hope you liked it. Now I'm going to read some of these comments. So, Icy Wolf Star 21 says, how did the US give up on public transit? So, I responded with when people started getting into cars and when freeways were introduced to American cities. Like, I don't mind freeways if, they were like out of the city or if they're in rural areas, but when they get integrated into the city, nah, that's pretty much of a mess. All right, Jabali says transit should be cheap because not everyone drives. Yeah, it should be cheap. Because I can see like a lot of bad drivers out there. They have been getting into accidents. There are like deaths related to like car crashes. Okay. I'm still planning on driving though. Okay, that's cool. But yeah, I kind of agree. I want to drive though. Same. But I may be scared of it. Yeah, the fear of driving can get pretty normal because I deal with it too. Jabali says, I'm also planning on driving too, but I'm debating on having my parents teach me or go to a driving school. I mean, you could always go to a driving school because the people there are like experts at driving. Right. Jay says, the Netherlands seemed like it is an awesome country and I would like to visit there. Yeah, I agree. I would. Same. Alright, T. Do you want me to like react to another video? Or should I like wrap the stream up? Okay. I think I'm gonna show one more video. And then the stream will be wrapped up. Okay, so this video is the video that got me introduced to not just bikes. Alright, I'm going to share this video with you. But if you like the suburbs, then I respect your opinion.
I grew up in a car-infested city called London, Ontario, Canada. But we don't want to raise our kids in an environment like this, and we moved to Amsterdam instead. So why is that? One thing you immediately notice when coming to the Netherlands is that there are a lot of children around. You'll routinely see even young children cycling to school, playing with their friends, and just hanging out in the city. The Dutch are famous for having the happiest kids in the world, and a big part of that is the fact that they can literally have chocolate sprinkles for breakfast. But the other big factor is the level of independence that children have here. I got used to seeing children everywhere, so it was amazing to see the difference the first time I returned to my hometown in Canada. I drove around several residential neighborhoods, and while I occasionally saw some kids in the park with their parents, I never saw any children out on their own, and that's really sad. I've talked to some parents from suburban Canada about why they don't let their children out on their own, and they usually say it's because it's too dangerous. One person even said, Somebody could come along with a white van, scoop them up, and nobody would even notice. Now, that's insane because Canada is one of the safest countries in the world and abductions by strangers are exceedingly unlikely. So, why do people think this? Well, there are various reasons for this cultural change, including an increase in fear-mongering media, but this is an urban planning channel, so we're going to talk about the reasons linked to city design because there are a lot of them. In her famous book, Jacobs refers to an effect she calls eyes on the street. Essentially, it means that people feel safer to be in places with many other people, like here, in this suburb of Amsterdam. By comparison, North American-style car-dependent suburbia is desolate for people outside of a car. It's depressing to walk there, and I know, because I've done it a lot in the process of filming these videos. I'm almost always the only one out walking, and I definitely get the feeling that if something happened to me, hundreds of people would drive by without even noticing. So it shouldn't be too surprising that some parents are uncomfortable having their children walk in an environment like this. Now, there's another safety reason that's a bit more rational. Canadian and American cities are really dangerous for pedestrians. While overall traffic fatalities in developed nations have generally fallen steadily since the 1970s, in the US and Canada, a big part of this was achieved by putting almost everyone inside of a car. But while people inside of cars may be safer, pedestrian deaths have increased significantly in the past few decades due to an increase in car traffic, larger trucks and SUVs, distracted driving, and higher vehicle speeds. Ultimately, these unsafe roads lead to a vicious circle. Parents are more likely to drive their children everywhere because it's not safe due to all the cars. But in doing so, they're adding one more car to the problem and making it even less safe. I'd like to point out that this is a unique problem caused only by cars. I mean, nobody ever kept their kids from walking to school just because too many people took the tram. But also, it's impractical for children to go anywhere on their own in a place like this. Suburbia is car dependent. That means it's almost impossible to get anywhere without a car. So even if you wanted your child to walk somewhere, they simply can't. It's either too far or it's not feasible because of a lack of sidewalks. When I have discussions with people from my suburban hellscape of a hometown, they usually agree that the city is quiet and soul-crushingly boring, but they will inevitably say, "But it's a good place to raise children." I completely disagree. Suburbia may be a good place to shelter toddlers, but as soon as a child is more than about 6 years old, being trapped in a McMansion on the edge of town seriously inhibits their growth and independence. They might be able to walk to a friend's house if they're lucky enough to live somewhere with a sidewalk, but they're unlikely to be able to walk to school or anywhere else for that matter. In the Netherlands, 60% of children walk or cycle to school compared to 28% in Canada. Mostly those kids who live in the few remaining walkable pre-war neighborhoods that would be illegal to build today due to modern zoning. But when I was a kid, that number was 58% in Canada, almost identical to the Netherlands today. Look at these Canadian kids walking through their rural school in the 1920s, through the snow, uphill both ways. Yeah, that never happens anymore. This is the bicycle parking lot of a typical middle school in Amsterdam. And this is the bicycle parking lot of an elementary school. It is obvious here that the majority of children arrive on their own bicycles. I'm constantly hearing excuses from North Americans as to why kids can walk or cycle to school in the Netherlands, but not in Canada. And it's usually some nonsense about the weather or the hills. Do either of these things explain the massive drop in the number of kids walking to school in Canada? Did Canada's weather get worse in the past 40 years? Did the hills get higher? No, of course not. But we did stop building family-friendly housing anywhere that wasn't car-dependent. Meanwhile, here in the Netherlands, it's not just kids in cities who cycle to school, it's everywhere. Bicycle Dutch has several videos showing dozens of children cycling long distances to school in suburbs, towns, and villages. And it's more than just school, too. kids have lots of sports and other activities. So in the Netherlands, it's very common to see children walking or cycling while dressed in football gear, not that kind of football, or hockey gear, not that kind of hockey, because they travel to all these activities by themselves. In the US and Canada, you have the stereotype of the suburban soccer mom, the mother who spends all of her time shuttling her kids around from school to activities to playdates and back. Because until a kid is about 16 years old and has their own driver's license, they need to be driven around everywhere by their parents, and this is considered normal. Is it any surprise that kids in the US and Canada don't get enough exercise?
It's not surprising since the outside world is filled with cars and roads.
I can't blame them for stay inside playing video games all day when outside looks like this. These problems originate in car-dependent suburbs, but unfortunately, decades of suburbanization have changed the overall culture where now many Canadians don't believe it's safe for any children to be out on their own. So even if you could afford to live in one of the very few remaining walkable neighborhoods, you still can't give your children the independence they deserve. For example, here in Amsterdam, we started allowing our children to go to the park without us when they were 9 and 6 years old. This is totally normal and accepted in the Netherlands. If we let our children do this in Canada, we would literally have someone call the police, or worse. Now, you might think I'm exaggerating, but there are stories about this happening all over the US and Canada. And the one that angered me the most was the story of Adrian Crook. Adrian is a father of 5 children and lives in downtown Vancouver. He has always been a vocal advocate of allowing kids to have their independence and has written about how walkable urban city design makes this easier and more practical. As part of this effort, Adrian and his kids would ride the bus to school every day. He did this with them for 2 years, but in 2017, he started letting them do it on their own. A short time later, he was anonymously reported to the Ministry of Children and Family Development. The whole story is available on his blog that I'll link to below, but in the end, the ministry decided that children under the age of 10 could not be unsupervised in or outside of the home for any amount of time. And if Adrian let any of his children out unsupervised again, even to go to the store across the street, his children would be taken away from him. Adrian literally had to spend 3 years of his life suing the Ministry of Children and Family Development just to allow his children to have some independence. And if you think that's insane, in Ontario, the province where I'm from, children legally cannot be on their own until they're 16 unless, quote, adequate supervision is provided. When I was a kid, adequate supervision was, say, having the phone number of a neighbor. But the problem is, what constitutes adequate supervision is becoming increasingly strict and arbitrarily applied. This article has examples from all over Canada, where child welfare investigations were started because, for example, a 9-year-old walked to school on her own, or because a mother allowed her children to play in the fenced backyard of their own house while she was watching them from inside. Now, you might say that these visits from police or social workers are just overreactions and it's better to be safe than sorry. But these social workers have the power to literally take your children away from you. You're crazy if you don't think this has a chilling effect that ultimately limits the independence of children in North America. Personally, I have absolutely no interest in finding out the hard way what the currently accepted definition of adequate supervision may be when it comes to keeping custody of my children. Unfortunately, the solutions to these problems are not easy because they involve changing not just cultural issues, but also the fundamental design of North American cities and suburbs. Traditional mixed-use walkable neighborhoods have a multitude of benefits, but walkability is nearly impossible to retrofit on top of car-dependent suburbia. And the last few remaining walkable places in the US and Canada are in such high demand that they're completely unaffordable to most people. Of course, we're also not building any more walkable places like this in Canada because they're illegal to build due to zoning and car-centric regulations like minimum parking requirements. So, What was built 100 years ago is it. We're not getting any more. And if you can't afford it, too bad. There's this insane myth in North America that when you have kids, you need a car and you need to live in suburbia, when the exact opposite is true. What children really need is fewer cars, because cars are dangerous, especially for children. Plus, newsflash, kids can't drive. But they can walk or cycle, though only.
That is 100% true. With cars, you need a license, but with bikes, you do not need one. And I miss when parents would teach their kids how to bike.
Only if it's safe. Here in the Netherlands, almost all new neighborhoods are walkable, and some of them are even car-free. Unsurprisingly, you see kids traveling on their own and playing together in the streets. So a few years ago, my wife and I had to make a decision. What kind of life did we want for us and, more importantly, for our children? And the solution seemed pretty clear. We moved to the country with the happiest kids in the world. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my supporters on
Okay, so I guess we're gonna wrap this up. And yes, the stream was pretty difficult to do, especially when doing it on a Chromebook. So guys, I'll see you sometime online. And I got Ariel Sky 2596 signing out. Peace. Sorry for my stuttering.